That's what the nonprofit Brookings Institution says is the average cost of raising a child from birth to 17 years of age.
Compared to the decade that we were born in, that's at the very least double the cost of having a kid. And some sources indicate it's actually closer to 3 or 4 times what it was. In fact, these numbers don't even include the cost of college.
According to Pew Research, only 45% of individuals 18 to 34 were not receiving financial aid from their parents.
The fact that it takes so much more financially to start or support a family today is because the cost of everything has skyrocketed over the years.
But while this is happening, household income has simply not been able to keep up with these other expenses, leading consumer affairs research to say that Gen Z has 86% less purchasing power than baby boomers did at the same age.
We've been doing a lot of reading about how different essential costs of living and raising a family have evolved over the decades, and we wanted to share with you everything we found adjusted for inflation. They say it takes a village,
so why not join us? Let's take a moment to travel back in time to when gas was 27 cents per gallon, a carton of eggs was about 60 cents, and women weren't allowed to have credit cards or open a bank account in their own names.
We're talking about the 1950s and 60s, when our grandparents smoked cigarettes without a care and brought home their little bundles of joy who we call mom and dad.
Back then, the estimated cost to raise a child 0 to 17 was around $25,000, or when adjusted for inflation, around $198,000 in today's numbers. That means what's being estimated today is about a 56% increase in cost.
Now, to really understand how these numbers have evolved over the years, we can't just look at the cost of things. As we mentioned, we have to take into account inflation, and also it's helpful to know the median household income, meaning how much was the average take-home pay for a family, and what sort of purchasing power did it have back then.
For example, in the 1950s, the median household income was $3,300, while the median home price was just over $7,000. So that means a home would cost about 200% or 2 times the median household income.
Today, an average home can cost over 500% or 5 times a household's annual income.
And this sort of price increase can be seen across the board. Just to give you a couple more comparisons.
In 1960, childcare and education were estimated to take around 2% of a household's income, whereas today it's about 24%. It goes without saying that is an enormous increase. Another example is how in 1960, the average healthcare cost per person was around $146, but in 2024, it was over $7,000.
Now, we could do an entire video on healthcare because honestly, the costs are asinine, especially when you consider that after being adjusted for inflation, the cost of giving birth to your child at a hospital back in 1950 was about $600 to $700, while today it's over $14,000, and that's not even including a C-section, which could add another 10 grand to the bill. But anyway.
These are all enormous increases, but we're also looking at a big gap in time. What if we fast forward to the 1980s and 90s when our parents had goofy flock of seagull haircuts and fornicated at a Madonna concert to eventually make Yours Truly? Here's what we found that was really quite interesting.
The funny thing that a lot of millennials and Gen Zers don't know about baby boomers is that in the 1980s, our parents also had to deal with enormous amounts of inflation that reached over 14%. And to put that into perspective, I'm sure you've heard lots of people complaining about the current inflation that we're all dealing with, but the post-pandemic inflation spiked around 9%. Still super duper high, but obviously not nearly as bad as 14%.
So needless to say, families were getting crushed in the early 80s. Between 1980 and 1990, the annual expenses of clothing for an 8-year-old grew by more than 50%. Housing costs saw an increase of nearly 10%. People felt like they couldn't keep up, and as a result, they actually had less kids because the cost of having them just kept increasing. Does any of that sound familiar? Also, in the 1980s, there was a big problem with mortgage interest rates. They went as high as 16.5% in 1981, and as far as we could find, this is still the worst mortgage rate in history. So how does this all compare to today?
Well, do you want the good news or the bad news?
I want the bad news.
Okay, you asked for it. In 2025, the median household income, according to U.S. Census Bureau data, is around $75,000. And the median home price, well, that's about $414,000, which means a home for today's average American family is around 5.5 times their household income. That means homes are approximately 57% more for this generation. But before you start feeling down about housing, hold on to your emotional support pigeon, because this next section has potential to elicit feelings of feral, table-flipping rage. There are two categories that we really haven't touched on yet, but their rate of growth over the past few decades has been so insane we thought we'd address them separately here.
The first category squeezing the life out of the American wallet is healthcare. After adjusting for inflation between 1960 and 2023, the cost of healthcare per capita increased nearly 983%. Now, before we all start foaming at the mouth, we do have to agree that there are some decent explanations for this. For example, advances in medical technology. In the 1970s, we got the first machines that could do full-body MRI scans, and by the 1980s, that technology became commercially available and used across the nation.
On top of this, there's been an incredible amount of research, development, and clinical trials, because when the MRI machine finds something wrong, it'd be nice if they could do something about it. And so all of this has a cost that in our society has been passed on to consumers and healthcare systems.
Then, as a result of these innovations and technological developments, we've been blessed to have an aging population. People are living longer than they used to, and so while the costs have risen, we have to agree that these are good things. However, we can't forget about one of the biggest factors for medical inflation: greed.
A really fast explanation of this, and a big reason why costs of healthcare have skyrocketed over the generations, is simply due to the consolidation of hospitals, insurers, and providers.
What does that mean? Well, over the years, hospitals, insurance companies, and drug companies have merged together, either by big players purchasing smaller healthcare providers or simply running them out of business. As a result, there are fewer and fewer options for patients. This means big corporations now control a huge part of the healthcare system. We, the patients, have no other options. And when that happens, prices go up. To give you an idea of the scale in which this is happening, in 2021 alone, there were more than 1,400 private equity deals in healthcare, totaling $209 billion.
How does this contribute to your cost of living and raising a family today? Well, when private equity or big hospitals buy up smaller ones, they don't have to compete with anyone, so they can raise the prices. The same thing happens when insurance companies merge. They can pay doctors and hospitals less, but they charge you and me more money for care. And since the focus of this video is all about how the cost of living and raising a family has evolved over the years, this obviously plays a huge role because healthcare is an absolute essential for everybody at some point in their lifetime. And hey, if you think paying a fortune just to keep your family alive and well is rough, wait until you get the bill for our bonus category in today's video.
Why is it a bonus category? Well, if you remember all the way back to the beginning, the price that these financial institutions are estimating it costs to raise a child born in modern times only includes expenses ages 0 to 17. Unless you're raising some genius prodigy like Sheldon Cooper, that price doesn't include this final category of higher education.
Because nothing says financial ruin quite like dropping 6 figures so your kid can take a semester of Taylor Swiftery, history and literature through Taylor Swift. And heads up, that's not a joke. The University of Missouri offered this class in the spring of 2023. The University of Texas at Austin and New York University's Clive Davis Institute also taught courses covering Taylor Swift. And you know what? I would absolutely take one of those courses.
Of course you would. You went to college and we're still paying for it.
That's right.
And the reason this should be included in the cost of having a kid is because of a study by Sally May. 77% of American families used parent income and savings to pay for at least some of their kids' college expenses, with 18% of parents using borrowed funds to pay for a portion of that education.
The study showed that the average total parent contribution for their kids' college expenses came out to about $13,000 per year, with a mix of that coming from their income in addition to taking out loans to supplement the extra expense.
This is definitely a long way from what our parents and grandparents were looking at for the cost of higher education, even after adjusting for inflation. Public institutions used to cost just under $3,000 annually, and now have ramped up over the past 5 decades to nearly $11,000 on average. But private institutions have seen an even steeper increase, all the way up to $38,000 annually. And remember, you have to multiply that number by 4 at least to get a bachelor's degree.
This is why more and more kids and parents alike have been forced to take on debt such as student loans, which then increase the cost of college even further because of interest.
The cost of living can simply feel like this never-ending pressure that just keeps constantly pushing down to keep you on the edge.
I know that for us, we've talked about how sometimes it feels like when we're finally catching up, it's like the goalposts get moved and we have to start all over again. And that can honestly feel so incredibly overwhelming.
But something we noticed when doing research for this channel and creating these videos in general is that while certain challenges may be unique to the time that we're living in, the fact that we have these challenges that previous generations didn't is actually not unique. It's really easy to get bogged down by all of this data and information when we look at it up close, but if we zoom out, throughout history there has always been various opportunities and various challenges that each generation has to face. And we've talked about some of those challenges today, but that doesn't mean there isn't also tremendous opportunity.
While the cost of college is more than 3 times more than it was, we also have access to information, education, and the ability to learn and level up our skills in ways that no other generation in history has been able to.
In a split second, we can access knowledge from some of the greatest doers, teachers, and innovators in the world. We can reach out and connect with people anywhere on the globe.
I mean, think about it. My grandfather was born in the 1920s, and one of the biggest inventions of the time was the Band-Aid.
Today, we have computers in our pockets that real people like you and me somehow are using to make millions of dollars.
We have opportunities to start our own businesses, make our own products, and work from the comfort of our own home.
If you're lucky enough to afford one, but if not, you can always make a side hustle reviewing chicken nuggets on TikTok. After all, this is America, where priorities are clearly optional.
We're just getting started, so if you want to see more,
like and subscribe.